So I just want to announce if anybody in the YouTube audience would like to join us in this webinar or in our global check-in, please write to the email addresses on the YouTube channel, and we will send you the information you need to join us. And let's see. And
yeah, Art went over on the chat
onto YouTube. Okay, so we'll watch for your comments and read them to the group as well. And so just to give you a schedule for the YouTube audience, tomorrow at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, we will have Dr. Tamara Russell, who will be doing part 2 of her presentation with us on how the body and the psyche connect together. So that's on Tuesday. On Wednesday is our usual Jung reading group, advanced reading group session. Then on Thursday, we have Dr. Liliana Wabha, who is one of the 18 Jungian analyst authors in this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And her session, which is at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time and 2 p.m. Sao Paulo time, is on Imagination for Evil. So it's going to be a very, very interesting session. And our member from Brazil, Mirtes Oliveira, is going to help us with interpretation if that's needed. That's going to be on Thursday at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, so 7 a.m. for you, Joss, and 1 o'clock in the morning for you, Nick. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. Enough sleep beforehand. Yep.
And then, so then on Saturday at 10 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, we're going to be hearing the story of Nicole Esplin, who is the love doctor. She sometimes appears on this session as well. And so if you see someone log in as the love doctor, that's Nicole. And she's going to tell us her story, which is quite an amazing story. But I'm not going to steal her thunder here. So it'll be worth watching. And it's this coming Saturday at 10 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, which is 12 o'clock noon in Sydney, where she lives, or she lives north of Sydney. Then on Sunday, we have Dr. Darian Pictet, who also has written, not in that book, this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, Volume 1. And I think if any of you go back and look at our earlier sessions that we've done with these Jungian analysts who've written in this book, you'll find that they're very powerful and very meaningful. And we had just an amazing one yesterday with Dr. Ashok Bedi. And I hope to have that online by Wednesday, let's say. And but Sunday, it's going to be 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So that's going to be 5 in the morning for you, Joss. And let me tell you the name of Dr. Pictet's essay that's in this book. It's called Movements of the Soul in the Red Book, is her essay. And then a week from tomorrow, we're going to have Rabbi Stephen Fuchs, who is past president of the World Union of Progressive Jews, and he has been a rabbi for about 45 years, mostly up in Hartford, Connecticut, but he also had a congregation in Columbia, Maryland for some time, and various other places early in his career. And Rabbi Fuchs now has a congregation in Florida, and he's written a book called Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives. And if you go, I'm going to put the name of this book on the YouTube chat, or where to find it. It's, you go into Jung.guru. That's the URL, Jung.guru. And then on Jung.guru, what do we get? Let me just tell you where it is on Jung.guru. His entire book, he allowed me to put onto it. And so if you go into morality and then religion and then books, then you find his book, which is Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives. And so he allowed me to publish his entire book here, and you can hear it here. Let's see, just to tantalize you, let me read from chapter 1 a little bit. Or is this the introduction? No, this is chapter 1, which is
that's Young.guru.
Yeah.
And then
I'm going to share the screen that I have up right now so that you can see what I'm looking at. Okay, so it's Jung.guru, and it's Jung Today. And I'm looking under morality, under this tab morality, and you keep drilling down into it until you get to Rabbi Fuchs's book. So you hit morality, religion, books, and then you get to his book, which I did here. But anyway, I love the beginning. I really love the beginning of this book because he says, the creation story in Genesis is one of the most misunderstood stories in all of literature. No narrative better illustrates the dichotomy between those who interpret the Bible literally and those who dismiss it as quaint folklore. Clearly, the story is not scientific. Come on, a big light to rule the day and a little light to rule the night, a heavenly firmament with water above and floodgates that open to cause a deluge. No, the Genesis creation story is not good science. It's not bad science. It is not science at all. It is an exquisitely instructive religious poem. The creation story in Genesis tells us nothing about how the world was created, but it tells us so much about why the world was created. It is hard to imagine so short a story containing so much valuable guidance, and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, if you're interested, you can read his book. It's a fairly short book, and it's published entirely on Jung.guru under morality, religion, books, Finding Ourselves in Biblical Narratives. That's Steve's book. And it's entirely there. And so you're good to go to read it beforehand. And welcome, Miles. I'm glad to see you here. And Sandy's here. Hi, Sandy. Nice to see you. I made a start on, I did make a start on your story, Sandy, but I didn't get it finished yet. I hope to get it published by tomorrow. And I have every intention, by the way, of removing from it the cheeky comment I made at the end. That wasn't a fair comment, probably, and it's certainly not a fair comment to put out in public. So I'm going to edit that out.
Which one are you talking about?
Oh, you mean they're all cheeky?
No, I don't know. I can't recall what you're referring to. But.
Well, good. So so you won't miss it when it's not there.
Okay.
Art Patterson wants to know if that book's on tape.
Is that book on tape? It actually is. It's on audible.com. In fact, another friend of mine who I'd like to bring on one day had urged me to get this book. He is also a classmate of mine, and so Steve sent it to me, and very much like my experience with Tim, I put it aside for about 8 months, and then I read it and I said, oh my God, this is right exactly the type of thing that I need, and is exactly what I was looking for. And so when I read it, I called Steve up and I said, Steve, you have to make a book on tape, or an Audible book out of this. And he said, well, the only time I could do it is in the next couple of days, because then I'm off doing this and that and so on. And I said, fine, come tomorrow. So he flew from Hartford to be in Baltimore, and I picked him up at the airport. I brought him home, sat him down in front of a mic and made him read his book. It then took me the next 2 months to get it edited completely, and to get it so that audible.com would accept it. And so I did that personally. I edited every word of that book several times. And just in terms of the quality of the sound and that sort of thing. And, taking out all the uhs and that sort of thing that's often in our speech. And then I managed to get it on audible.com. So you can actually find it on audible.com. And if you don't have access to audible.com, I happen to have some extra credits. So this is for Art Patterson. Art, if you want, write to me an email and give me your email address, and I will make a gift to you of this book so that you can listen to it, okay? And so just send it to me separately, though, not on chat. Send me your email and I will send you the book as a gift, okay? The Audible book. So anyway, so moving forward here, I want to, this is not a very hard book to read as compared to other Jungian books. And so what I want to do is I want to go through these last few pages and just hit some high points, and we can do a round of comments on the high points, and not be quite as detailed as we were before. And, very honestly, I forgot where we were, but 413, today's the 27th. Oh, so we only did one paragraph the last time, as I recall. Okay.
Well, I've got page 332, but I'm not.
Yeah, on page 332, as I recall, we got through one paragraph in that evening, and so then we got to the Gnostics, and I didn't want to take that on at the end of the evening last time, so let me talk about it now and talk about you know, this issue about whether Jung himself was a Gnostic. And the answer is yes and no. Jung himself, and so this part begins with this sentence. The old question posed by the Gnostics, whence comes evil, has been given no answer by the Christian world, and Origen's cautious suggestion of a possible redemption of the devil was termed a heresy. Today we are compelled to meet that question, but we stand empty-handed, bewildered, and perplexed, and cannot even get into our heads that no myth will come to our aid, although we have such urgent need of one. As a result of the political situation and the frightful, not to say diabolical, triumphs of science, we are shaken by secret shudders and dark forebodings, but we know no way out. And very few persons indeed draw the conclusion that this time the issue is the long forgotten soul of man. So I just want to go back and talk a little bit about Dr. Jung's approach to the Gnostics. First of all, one of the key things that he said about them to confirm that he wasn't actually a Gnostic and he wasn't trying to create a Gnostic religion per se, was that he didn't know enough about them, because the only thing we know about the Gnostics is what was written by their enemies, namely the Catholic Church. And so Gnosticism was burned out of the Catholic Church as heresy, you know, back in the 4th century or so. And most of their works were burned. And so we actually don't have their works directly. What we have is the Catholic Church, which always kept good records, thankfully. You know, my favorite one of that is when Galileo kneeled down and put his hand on the Bible and swore before God and the inquisitors that the sun orbits the earth. Okay. He swore on a Bible at his trial for heresy. And as a result of that, he was allowed to live, but his penalty was that he could never look through a telescope again, which was sort of okay, because he had looked through a telescope so much that he'd burned out his retina, and so he couldn't see anyway. But he went off, instead of talking about astronomy, and invented quantum physics, among other, he invented 2 other sciences, quantum physics and one other, I forget which, when he was a guest of the Pope, let's say. And I think he was kept in the Pope's retreat. He wasn't never allowed out again. And he died 4 years later. But anyway, so the Gnostics were treated in a similar summary fashion. And so we only know about them what the church saved. And that's how we know about Galileo also. And so basically, I think Dr. Jung's reaction to the Gnostics was that they were into the experience of God. Okay, they were actually into the experience. And what is fundamental to Jungian psychology, absolutely fundamental, is that you can't know anything until you've experienced it for yourself. Okay, you can't know a revelation of any kind unless you've experienced it for yourself. And so that's fundamental to Jungian psychology. To the, you know, so does that make him a Gnostic? No, because he wasn't pushing a doctrine of the Gnostics per se. he was just trying to understand what they understood. And what they understood is, okay, you can know all the structure, all the logos going all the way up. And we've talked many times about the logos providing the skeleton and the structure. So the word, as in John 1:1, provides a skeleton by which people can think about certain issues. And that's what the New Testament is. But as I often say, the Holy Bible is just a black doorstop until somebody puts life into it. And so that means your pastor, and it means you reading the Bible and having it have meaning to you, or the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or whatever other holy book you happen to have. In my case, it's the Red Book. Okay. But also the more and more the Bible. I recognize the Bible, I recognize the Gita, and I recognize the Quran. And they're all true as psychic facts. And so so it's experiential. Okay. And it's, you go back to Adlerian psychology that says you can't teach a child that the stove is hot until they touch the stove. Then they know what hot is. It's exactly like that. Okay, you have to have the experience. And so
What about the Torah and the Kabbalah?
what about them?
You acknowledge them as well?
Oh, of course, yes, absolutely. And in fact, I've thought about inviting my friend Eva Ryder, who's an expert on the Kabbalah. And what was the other one that you mentioned? You said the Kabbalah. Say it again.
Torah?
Oh, the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. And so that's, if you come next Tuesday, you can talk to Steve about that, because that's the essence of what the Jews look to, is the Torah. And that's the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay. And so it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay. And that's what his book is about. So if you go over to Jung.Guru and read his book, you'll find the major biblical stories that anyone who's studied the Bible at all will be familiar with. And starting with Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, all the greats, Abraham, and so on, because obviously Abraham is the sort of the patriarch of all the Abrahamic religions. And why is that? Okay, it's because Abraham, the biggest thing that Abraham did was that he caused the end of human sacrifice to the gods. Okay, human beings all over the world before 1600 BC, okay, were offering human sacrifice as a way to propitiate the gods. In other words, to buy them off. And the idea was, well, if you gave your first son for sacrifice, then the gods would know that you're serious about believing in them, and so they would then be kind to you for the rest of your life. And so I'm mighty happy that we stopped doing that, since I'm a first son. I might have not gotten very far, but the point was that Abraham had this vision, and it's exactly the same vision in Islam. The holiday Eid al-Adha, which comes after Ramadan, is exactly that. It's the celebration of Abraham realizing he didn't have to sacrifice Isaac. He could give a goat instead. And so, that was good for the Jewish masters, because then the temple always had lots to eat, right? Because the Jews would come and sacrifice their goat, and then people could eat inside the temple. I mean, the temple, people that ran the temple. So that was the beginning of all the Abrahamic religions. And even though Islam really didn't get going for another 2,000 years after that, but they still point to that as an extremely important point in time. And it was very interesting for me last summer that all this finally clicked together. Thank you, Agni. All this finally clicked together because I had Lana staying at my home when Eid al-Adha happened. And she came out of the bedroom where she was staying rather, drowsy and so on, and went into the bathroom. And then she came out and she had this big grin on her face. And she said, "It's Eid."
Eid.
Eid, okay, it's Eid. Although she called it Eid, I think.
Mhm.
But anyway, okay, so it's pronounced Eid?
In Farsi, yeah. Eid.
Okay, all right. Everybody I've ever known called it Eid,
Okay.
and I know a lot of Muslims. So,
Okay.
but I don't deny that in Farsi it may be Eid. Okay, and so. Anyway, she came out of the bathroom and she had this big grin on her face and she said, "It's Eid." It was like it's Christmas, and I realized I've been in the Muslim world and in Saudi Arabia many times on Eid al-Adha, and I never really realized what it was about. And so I said, "Okay, so Lana, tell me what it's about." And she told me, and it's about that. It's about Abraham sacrificing a goat instead of his first son, and the significance of that, and God telling him that it's okay, which was the vision that he had. And so anyway, then we had just a perfect day together, Lana and I. And at the end of the day, it was a beautiful summer evening with the moon was up over the Chesapeake Bay, and Joss knows the scene very well of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge and so on. And Lana and I were sitting out in the evening. I guess it was maybe 9 at night, and just chatting and having a lovely day. We had a lovely day together. And shortly after that, she said, "Well, I got to go." And she went back to Qatar. But anyway, we had a really good day that day. Okay, but what for Jung, the essence of it is that the Gnostics were actually about having the experience of God and not preventing from having the experience, whereas the Catholic Church wanted to put itself between God and the average man. And so it's the priests that get to have the direct experience with God, and you basically take their word for it. And of course, in Islam, you do have a direct experience with Allah. So that's different. But anyway, the origins of the religions are the same. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all the same.
Well, I would like to add to that.
Please.
The Gnostics and that he studied were the he called Palisades, which is in the scrutinies he pretended to be the Palisades Gnostic priest, and so
Right.
by him. And so the scrutinies is the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which is it's included in this MDR book at the end.
In the Red Book, in
in
the folio edition of the Red Book. Well, it's in both of them. It's in the Reader's edition.
There's a short version, 7 Appendix 5 in.
In Memories, you're saying?
Yeah, if you get the right version, you've got the shortened version.
Oh yeah.
The Scrutinies in the Red Book is the long version.
Right.
But anyway, the point is that the difference that I see is that the Gnostics realized that there was an evil side.
Right.
And sometimes when you have this experience, what they call a mysterium tremendum or something like that, that it can be either good or bad.
Right.
And so you can either be terrified or you can be feeling the love,
Right.
And so I think that's probably why they wanted the Gnostics, even though they had the experience, they realized that there was a darker side or a shadow.
Right.
And Jung had experienced that, and he was looking for history of people that have had those experiences.
Right. And he points out that the Book of Job is an example of that.
That's correct. Yeah. In other words, he was trying to find somewhere in history that this has happened, because he didn't, he didn't want to put this out unless he found some evidence of it.
Right. And so the point was that the Catholic Church, up until today, presumably, has maintained this idea of privatio boni, which is a Latin term for privation of good. And their point was that God is all good. That's their argument. God is all good. There is no such thing as evil. Evil is only the privation of good. But the reality is, which we know from the 20th century, there is manifest evil in the world, and it does exist. And as Jung says here in this book, he said, what would these old storytellers have said about Hiroshima, right? And I had occasion to live in Japan 17 years after World War II, and saw many people who were survivors of Hiroshima at that time. And, the interesting take that the Japanese have on it is that they were basically glad that it happened because it ended the war. And what they knew was, they basically went all in the Battle of Okinawa when they started to throw kamikazes at the American fleet. And they just didn't have any young men left to fight the war. And so what the Japanese were facing in 1945 and possibly into 46 was the possibility in the spring of 46 that there would have been an invasion of the Japanese mainland, especially Honshu. And and the only thing that they had to put against that invasion was 15-year-old girls with spears made out of bamboo. I mean, that's literally what they were thinking. And so surviving Japanese felt that, you know, 1 million lives were saved by having the pain of Hiroshima, which, you know, killed 100,000 people on the spot, but and killed many others over time. But they were grateful, and I recall that the first time I went to Hiroshima, I was very apprehensive because I didn't know how an American businessman would be taken in Hiroshima. And basically, the only question I got was, had I gone to their Peace Museum, where they have a museum about the atom bomb and the destruction of Hiroshima, and they want very deeply for all foreigners to visit it, all Japanese too, and but other than that, I found the people in Hiroshima the most welcoming, the nicest people in Japan, absolutely. Okay, and I lived there in business for 5 years, from 1980 to the end of 1984, and the people in Hiroshima are the nicest, most welcoming people in Japan, much to my surprise. And the only bad thing I ever saw happen in Hiroshima was in the hotel I was staying at one time. The mayor of Portland, Oregon at that time, I don't know his name, fortunately, so I can't slander him, but he got himself a little bit looped in the bar and started to make a lot of really offensive remarks very loudly in this bar. And finally I had to go over to him and told him to shut up and, you know, knock it off. And you know, he wanted to challenge me, and I said, you really don't want to do that. Particularly, he was looped, so it wouldn't have been a fair fight at all. So he shut up and left in a huff. But anyway, but there is evil, okay? And this was Jung's point. And the other Catholic doctrine is summum bonum, the sum of all goodness is God. And of course, what Job did was when he went to appeal to God, he appealed to God's good side and not to his dark side. And so it was recognized in the Old Testament that God had a dark side, but then when Christianity came along, they switched it into all good God, and the problem was that it turned out God isn't all good. I mean, I facetiously remarked that's like saying Hitler and Stalin just didn't get enough mother's milk. You know, they were deprived of the good, and so therefore they became bad. And obviously, it's a lot more complex than that. And so,
Well, I think the lesson here is that we're all capable of evil. We have evil inside us, and if we suppress that, it can be a pressure cooker.
yeah,
And you're seeing that coming out with this virus now. You're
sure.
seeing that those acts coming out because we've tried to keep it under pressure and not recognize that we're capable. And guess what? We spring out and can be.
Right, and it's going to get a lot worse because, you know, people think, oh, this has been awful, but now we're through it. We're not through it by any means, not at all.
Yeah.
And The
Well,
idea that things are getting better is just a falsehood based on the numbers.
the collective shadow is upon us here. So
Yeah. And, yesterday we had, it was either yesterday or the day before, we had 3,700 deaths in the United States to coronavirus. And, if you think people are mad now about shutdown, wait until the fall, or anytime between now and the fall, because it's not going to lighten up during the summer, quite obviously. And everybody by then, everybody in the country is going to have lost somebody that's very close to them, to the
3,700 in one day, Skip.
yes, 3,700 in one day.
Oh my God. No, okay. Just, yeah. Wow. That's
Right. And today it was announced that that they undercounted by 15,000 deaths in February and March. And I have no doubt, because I've been looking at the worldometers.info statistics every day and keeping track of them. And so I'll just show you. Okay, so here's the U.S. as of today. Let's see if I can show it to you. I guess maybe not. Okay, so that's the U.S. as of today. Yesterday we hadn't crossed 1 million, but today it's showing 1,010,000 and 56,796 deaths. And let's see, I have the totals. Yesterday it was 55,377 deaths at the end of the day. So maybe we've had 1,500 deaths yesterday, but then the day before that, it went from 52,092 to 55,377 in one 24-hour period. And now they're admitting that there's more deaths. And the thing that I've been fascinated with is looking at the death rate in Europe, and in the European countries, the death rate is over 10%, in Italy, France, Spain, and the UK. But in Germany, they're only admitting to less than half of 1%. And that can't be, that just can't be. And of course, we know, because we've been talking about our friend Thomas Ars, that his death apparently was rated a heart attack on Easter Sunday, but it's pretty clear to me that it was a coronavirus death, but it was miscounted. And so Germans are saying they have less than half of 1%, but everybody else in Europe is having way more. And so something is wrong with that.
Skip, we also had a governor today, or an official, decided that they wanted to reopen the schools to let the children go to school.
Really? In what state?
I can't remember, but it was on the news. But in thinking about that, it's like, okay, it was because the children don't get very sick. But nobody seems to think about that the children live with their parents, and their parents live with their grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And they can come in, and I mean, if you've had children, you know that they go out and they come in with a cold, you get the cold. You
Right.
know, it's
Sure.
it's just the way it works.
Yeah, I mean, I know.
But the reasoning behind this is just, I don't get it. I really don't. Sad.
Yeah, it's very sad, because they're going to pay the price. And this was Dr. Jung's observation even back in World War I, that people weren't going to learn until there was blood, and that people learn by witnessing blood. And so basically that was his observation. And if you go back in the Red Book, you'll see that, you get people feast their eyes on this horrible stuff they actually wanted at an unconscious level. And it says you shouldn't want it, but many people do want it.
It's subconscious, and it has to do with what we're talking about, the evil part.
Yeah. I don't know if I can find that exact quote just in a moment, but maybe I can. I don't know. Anyway, it's not that important, but that is in the Red Book, where he says you'll feast your eyes on the blood and the death, and you'll be happy it's not you, and that sort of stuff. And I'm noticing that myself and acknowledging it. It's there. Even as we talk about this governor, whoever he is,
it's just they don't understand the long-term consequences. It's the chain of events.
Right.
And we don't have anybody up in our system that understands that chain.
Right. But sitting where I sit in Maryland, where we have a Republican governor, but he's been very responsible in terms of the coronavirus, and he is a responsible individual, no doubt. And and I say, well, I'm glad it's not happening in my state. If it's got to happen, let it happen somewhere else. And that's sort of an evil thought, isn't it? But I'd like everybody to pay attention. But at the same time, good can come of it. This conversation we're having tonight is because of the pandemic in 1918. Believe it or not. Okay, I mean, for those of you that are on the webinar know this, but some people watching on YouTube may not know that I'm here because of that pandemic, because my grandfather was engaged to a woman who, together with her 4 sisters, 5 girls in one family, died on one weekend in 1918 because of the Spanish flu. And as a result of that, my grandfather did not marry her. He married my grandmother. And if that hadn't happened, I would never have been born. So, from my point of view, the Spanish flu was good, because I wouldn't exist otherwise. But that's a hell of a thing to be chuckling about. And
I'm not sure causality and evil are to be merged together.
Say it again now.
Cause and effect is different from evil. And so if good can come after evil, this is contradictory in some way in terms of causality being part of evil and good.
Well, look, cause and effect, which was, let's take the Spanish flu and the fact that I exist. Okay, that's a cause and effect, and you're right. There's nothing evil about that. What's evil is when I chuckle about it. Okay, that's my shadow. And usually, very often, when you're laughing at a joke, you're actually laughing at something that's from your dark side, actually.
So are you saying that
is in your unconscious? Go ahead.
So is it the need to live selfishly or exist? Is that also evil?
No. The need to live. That it's not evil that I'm.
Think it's good that the
Well,
Spanish flu caused you to exist?
well, that may be evil. Okay, the fact that I do exist isn't evil. Okay, that's cause and effect. Okay, but when I think it's good that the Spanish flu killed that woman and her 4 sisters, what if I think that's good, then I'm being evil. That's my dark side.
I don't know about that. I don't know if that's actually what you were thinking, though, you know, right?
Well, I don't know. I'm freebooting here, Sandy. So I agree that there there are shades of goodness and shades of evil, right? And so if I never knew, for example, that happened, and that's in the chain of events that makes me possible. Okay, probably those sorts of things are in all of our ancestries. Okay, because all of us have
Tried, tried or
ancestors.
conquered.
Yeah, ancestors who did 2 things successfully. Going back to single-celled organisms. Okay,
They didn't die.
Yeah. Number 1, they survived until they reproduced. Okay. That's the 2 things that every one of your ancestors did. They all survived until they reproduced. And there's, lots of devouring, as Jung put it, lots of devouring and reproducing in that. Okay, and basically, this is what he observed in the plains of Africa when he went to Mount Elgon. He went up on a plateau where he was alone and there was no other human being present. He recounts that story in this book, and he looked out over the plain and he saw these rivers of different species, all just moving along, and every so often a tiger would jump out and eat a weak gazelle or something like that. But he said, here without human knowledge and reflection, God wouldn't know that his creation even existed. Okay, that those things had been happening for hundreds of millions of years, and no one was conscious of it. They were just devouring and reproducing, and killing and surviving, or surviving and reproducing, whatever it is. But it's only when humans came along and became reflective about it that
And now they kill goats.
Yeah, so now we kill an animal that doesn't have any reflection about it. But if you go to the supermarket, okay, everything in the supermarket was once alive. Okay, because all life lives on other life. And so, a person that's a vegetarian just never heard a tomato scream, right? but the reality is that all creatures live on other creatures. We all live on other life. And
that would make me careful about saying that the goat doesn't reflect. The goat doesn't reflect like in a way that we can understand.
right,
Just like we cannot hear the screams of the tomato. Yeah, just saying, just putting that out there.
well, that's fair enough. And if you think too much about it, it's very hard to
Well, it's a question
justify
of
going on. But go ahead, Sandy.
it's a question of what's evil. I mean, it's a word we're using,
Right.
and we're putting a lot of meaning into the word. We've decided certain things are evil and certain things are not.
Right. And so for 2,000 years, the Catholic Church, or not 2,000 years, but at least 1,800 years, the Catholic Church would burn anyone at the stake that didn't believe in their way. You know, you have to believe that it's only the privation of good that is evil. And but we're going to burn you at the stake if you think any other way, you know, which is what happened to the Gnostics.
Perhaps it's not like evil might be the privation of good, but it's not in this left right with a hard division in between. But perhaps evil occurs at the interface. Evil occurs at the interface between two poles, and it's dependent on the awareness that we bring to it. You know, and like, okay, I mean, I don't know what I'm saying also, and this might be not very satisfying, but I feel that evil, like at the end of the day, it like a lot of things, you know, it goes back to the heart. And when it comes to things like cause and effect, I feel that right now we actually kind of possibly already are at the end of history period. And what the end of history means to me is that there's so much information everywhere, and I'm not just talking about the internet, but basically there's so much information everywhere that all of us can, according to our own predilections, choose to trace whatever lines of causality, be they in our lives or within history or within the historical continuum, you know, from the universe to flat earthers down to, you know,
Sure.
our own ancestry. And I think for me, rather than think about what evil is, or even cause and effect, for me personally, I focus on the importance of being cognizant of you know, this ability to basically derive any reality we want to. And if all of us can do that, then all the more important it becomes to have stories that unite everyone on a basic level, and you know, basically create new myths for this new end of history period.
Right.
Which I feel is part of what we are going through now, the coronavirus. I feel it's part of that end of history thing too.
Yep. Nick, when you say end of history, what does that mean to you again? Tell me again what that means to you.
The end of history, okay, to me, the end of history means that it's about time. It's about time, and for me, it's like the kind of thinking that is behind things like the I Ching it's not a historical kind of mindset. And to me, in the West, we have this division between Chronos and Kairos, where Kairos means Kairos is closer to the I Ching to me. It's qualitative time, and then there's Chronos, meaning sequential time, and sequential time already smacks of, to me, cause and effect. A leads to B, leads to C, and for me, history in the sense of you know, the history that we have recorded and this line of causality and you know, causality, so loosely speaking, that we have in the history books, that is to me history. But that to me is a kind of awareness, and it's a very Chronos type of awareness that has kind of divorced us from the Kairos. And I feel that this is especially true in the West, but the West also is Singapore. You know, Singapore is the West. I'm basically, you know what I mean? But when I went to like Queensland and stayed with the Aborigines, which actually, I mean, now it's modern and, you know, they're just normal people.
Yeah.
I noticed that they actually live they live more in the Kairos. And you know, it's like, yes, they have day, they have night, and they do go to the store nearby, but they they don't live in historical time, and they're not tribal people, or I mean,
Right.
they live
So
in the
they,
rainforest.
so the Kairos is really the Eros, is really,
It's more connected, I feel.
yeah, living in the moment. So what you're saying, and I agree with you, because I think we've carried history about as far as it can go, and so suddenly, with the advent of the internet, everybody has access to everything. Okay.
And our sense of time changes as a result, you see.
Yeah.
So in that sense, Kairos is like coming up, but the difficulty and maybe the difficulty and the mess we are having to navigate now is Kairos coming up, but we have all this information, and all we've known is chronos and sequential time, and what happened before, what happened before, what happened before, and I feel that Kairos also results in us adopting a very narrow mode of thinking that shows up in a lot of our conversations, appearing contradictory when seen, from just a slight angle away. And then the last thing is that what I noticed about the Aboriginal people, I was hanging with this lady called Marilyn, is that things that we call synchronicity, it just occurs like that for them, It's just, and it's not amazing or impressive to them. So things we would call numinous experiences, or like, wow, that was such a synchronicity. For them, for them, it just occurs as the flow of the way that they interact with their environment, and from
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, Jung does say, and I somewhere in a paper somewhere, that there's an asynchronousness, in fact, to synchronicity. A causal synchronicity is a
right.
A causal meaning that a causal, I think, meaning that it's not the opposite of cause and effect, but it's not something that we can trace. We can trace a line of causality, but it will not satisfy that spontaneous creation of meaning.
Yeah,
you see,
it is like the I Ching or the Tarot or astrology or what have you, that those systems rely on synchronicity, and the synchronicity comes from the fact that every human being has in their psyche hooks or sore spots that need to be addressed one way or another. And so maybe you have a trouble with your mother or your father, let's say. And what the Tarot does is, if I read the Tarot and the Empress card comes up, I will say something about the Empress card, or about your mother, about mother. Something must be happening to your mother because this Empress card came up, right? Or if it's the High Priestess, then it's the Anima, so it's your girlfriend, or and so if I read the Tarot cards in that way, and I read to you for half an hour and show you 10 cards, I'm going to hit one of your hooks for sure, and probably I'll hit 4 or 5 of them. And so what happens is that I read the cards just intuitively. I say, I make a story out of the cards, and I have no idea how that's going to affect you, but it does affect you, because you have these hooks in your psyche, or sore spots in your psyche, that when I say something around your mother or your girlfriend, or around the prospect of death, or the devil, or what have you, it will conjure something going in your own unconscious, and you'll think that I said that directly to you. Okay. But it works by synchronicity, in the sense that I often have said that I can walk into an auditorium with 1,000 people, throw the cards across the stage, and read them right off the stage with no layout. Just read randomly whatever comes to my mind based on what I see in the cards. And everyone in the room will think I did a reading for them. But everyone in the room will have heard a different reading. Okay, you follow what I mean by that?
Yes.
Yeah. So what do you think about that, Sandy?
It's interesting. It's like a projective test, like a Rorschach.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. I mean, if I do that reading, I won't have any idea what you heard in the audience.
I don't think it's like a Rorschach in the sense that I think when we say when talking about the Rorschach and we say it's a projective test, at the end of that description, I feel that there's always this implied thing where the subject-object distinction is still preserved and maintained. However, when it comes to synchronicity, and I think this is especially what Jung got into, and it's the reason why he also tied in with Wolfgang Pauli, is because the projection there's a deeper, the alchemical level of it, where the thing outside and inside are the same. And in that sense, when you draw the tarot and the coins of the I Ching drops, it is not random. It is when the coins of the I Ching drops, the outside and inside collapse into a unity. You can still say that the coins are random, but you have to acknowledge that you are adopting a statistical mindset, and a statistical mode of knowing things.
Yeah, there's a probability factor in it, you're saying.
No, I am saying that there's a probability factor in it if you approach it with a probabilistic mindset.
But if you're not approaching it with a probabilistic mindset,
yep,
is it synchronous?
I agree with Nick that at the moment the coins drop, or at the moment the tarot drops, it closes out all other options, right? But it closes out all other options between the reader and each individual in the room. And that closeout is different for every individual. That's what I'm saying. So Sandy, you wanted to give us a psychoanalytic concept of good and evil. So tell us that. Okay.
Well, I'm spinning it that way. So take it with a salt. So is anybody familiar with the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein?
Yes. Yes.
Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and you're familiar with splitting as the most primitive defense mechanism that we're endowed with as infants.
Well, enlighten me, because if I ever knew this, I don't know it well enough to respond.
Okay. So Melanie Klein formulated a notion of, I'll make this graphic for you so you will get it. She came up with the concept of the good breast of the mother and the bad breast of the mother, all being the mother as a whole. But the infant can only understand things from a part object perspective. They can't conceptualize the mother as a whole, mm-hmm. or the mother's mind even. They were only seeing the fact that they are feeling good, mm-hmm. when they are suckling.
Right.
Or when they're being contained.
Right.
Okay.
Sure.
And when the mother is unavailable or is not there, or the child has reached frustration level.
Yep.
And in that short period or period of intense frustration, for Melanie Klein, that is the most, that inner frustration is where the origins of like hatred, you know, and this like extreme rage, the cry of the baby, the screaming agony of the baby that doesn't know when mother is going to come back, and it just is experiencing all bad. Mm-hmm. And the infant cannot differentiate whether it's it feels all bad. So it literally is like the embodiment of, like, it doesn't matter if the mother's unavailability is bad, it just feels bad. So it's just all bad. There's no differentiation with self and other yet.
Sure.
And so when the mother returns and the baby is frustrated and is being soothed, the infant is angry at the mother for having been gone. So the infant bites the nipple.
Right.
And this is where oral aggression is, you know, we would say originates, or orality, and, you know, that hunger from that need. So splitting is the defense mechanism that it's like our first defense is all bad, all good. The infant brain cannot understand anything in between, or that there's an other, you know,
Right.
It's just part object. It's just the good breast and then the bad one, the one that returns and is like, where were you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So we like to think of, you know, every individual as having that in them. And when frustration reaches a certain threshold, there's just this evil, and there's no differentiation whether it's evil in me or evil in you. It's all spewed outward, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why, you know, these projections come out, and, you know, therapists have to deal with this a lot. Like sometimes you're the bad therapist. You know, you're not giving them everything they want, and they're feeling frustrated, and they come in and they, you know, do these jabs at you, and they're biting at your nipple, and they're, you know, letting you know that, you know, they're frustrated with you. And then there's times where you're all good or you're idealized.
Yeah.
We call this a positive transference or a negative transference. And those frustrations run so deep inside a human being who, you know, has that frustration, that frustrated baby inside them, that somehow they weren't able to get to the next level of, you know, the higher, more socially appropriate defense mechanisms.
Andy, just a question. Do you ever encounter like patients who clients who you get the feeling that they actually are going to you to get to get validation rather than to actually improve?
Well, that's usually one of the first processes and stages of the therapy. Is you need to go on the side of their defense in order for them to feel heard, and then after that we can give them a little bit more to reflect on.
Right. Okay.
But if they're prone to narcissistic injury, and they feel that no one is, you know, they feel sort of a victim of a circumstance, and that they want that validation, that, you know, yes, it's kind of like, we call this mirroring. So they need mirroring, you know, for a while. And that's a developmental stage from, you know, 7 months to 2 years on, the mirror stage, where, you know, they need to be able to see themselves and the eyes of the mother, and the eyes of the therapist. And yeah.
No wonder. I once I have a cousin that's quite a bit younger, and she used to come over to my place when she was not a toddler, but a very small girl. And I remember she would. There was one occasion when she was like just crying and she couldn't stop. And I don't know why I did this, but I went in front of her. You know, I tried to calm her down, but she couldn't stop crying. She wouldn't stop no matter what I did. So I just started crying as hard as she did. And suddenly she stopped, and I will never forget her face. She looked at me with this like fascinated face, like, huh? You know, the tears still streaming, but instantly she stopped. You know, and then I got shocked. And so I stopped crying and wailing. And after about 3 seconds of staring at each other, like mouths open, she started crying again. Yeah, but that was fascinating.
Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, very cute. Also.
Well, certainly, we all have these instincts, and it's as we're growing from being a wild animal. When we're born, we're a wild animal, basically, and we have to learn how to be a human being. And for human beings, that takes a very long time. Some never make it, but Dr. Jung used to think it took till age 35. I think young people these days are considerably more precocious than when Dr. Jung was doing his work. And so we have a young man like Nick, who is very self-aware. And
I'm not young. I'm
You're not
losing
young?
hair.
Huh?
No, I've lost a lot of hair. That's why I always wear a cap. I'm not young. You're just old, Skip.
Oh, it's just I'm old, so everything.
Everyone is young.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, just kidding.
So, but the point is, you have to, in the first half of life, build up your ego so that you can deal with the slings and arrows of life, and there are lots of them. And I had a business partner once who we would raise money from a venture capitalist or something, and he would say, well, all we have to do is get this thing done, and then we're through. Then we've got enough money to keep the company going, and everything will be hunky-dory. And I kept saying, no, it won't. It's not going to be like that. We're constantly going to be dealing with problems, and so adult human beings, mature human beings, are problem-solving creatures. We solve 100 problems a day, or more, and it's everything from getting out of bed to when to use the toilet, what to eat for dinner. Those are all problems, and how to bring the food into the fridge and so on. And as mature human beings, we have to do that, and it doesn't stop until we stop. And so this one verse of the Bible that I keep referring to, and Jung referred to very often, is 1 John 4:1, which is examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not. Okay, examine the spirits. And the point is that there's two streams of ideation coming out of your unconscious, and one is on one side and thinks that it's going to get the bad breast, and one is on the good side and thinks it's going to get the good breast, type thing. And then the one that's on the bad side says, well, geez, I'm going to bite that nipple because so that's a spirit that's saying it's not a good, is angry and is going to respond in an angry way. But when we're adults, then we know that that's not what it's about, right? At the beginning, I mean, isn't that right, Sandy, that at the beginning you don't know any better, but later on,
Well, yes. Well, if the containing function is successful, meaning the mother can eventually help the infant hold the bad and the good in mind at the same time. And because of mothers who might have had the same type of trauma, as babies, or because of environmental impingements, or maybe another baby that comes onto the scene, that integration doesn't occur successfully. And anytime we are all very, very emotionally taxed, or there's a lot of strain on our psyche, we can regress into what you call the paranoid schizoid position. So,
Right.
which is the same thing as splitting.
And that's what we're seeing now, which is,
yeah, I'm good and the other is bad.
Yeah, like right now, everybody's afraid, and so everybody's going back to their default position.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so, well, go ahead,
okay.
Nick. Yeah, go ahead.
Is my voice clear? Because I just switched.
Yes, it's clear.
Oh, okay. I'm always kind of fascinated by when we discuss this kind of stuff, how there are like certain paradoxes, not within the threads that we speak. Okay, what I mean is like I agree with everything Sandy said and I understand it, but I was also thinking at the same time how that infant state is also like kind of a description of mysticism, not the splitting, but the dissolution of the boundary. And then I also think about what we just said, which was that we revert to our default position, which is that it's not I, but it's them, you know, and we blame other people. But that brought to mind this other idea, which is of like, what if you go around not thinking, but knowing that everyone actually is a reflection of you, right?
Yes.
And I don't mean negative sense. I mean that in I guess more the Buddhist or the higher mystical sense, and going around really seeing everyone as a reflection of you. And if you actually knew that, then there would be more onus and more moral imperative even for you to treat everyone, not just in that sense of, oh, do unto others as you like, you know, to be done unto you. I mean, although that is true, but really, if everyone is you and there's no boundary, then you know, you have.
Okay, I have something to add to that. So another term that is used with by Melanie Klein is called projective identification. So that is actually what facilitates this transition from, you know, splitting. Because if you identify parts of yourself, those part objects in the other, with the use of the projection and the use of the fantasy, essentially the other who you project onto, if they are able to help metabolize something for you, then they'll metabolize it like the mother bird that puts the food back into the baby's mouth, the bird's mouth, and then the baby bird can chew it up and metabolize it. But as what you said about mysticism, I do sometimes see that people can get carried away in that fantasy world and that projective side, but the more the sort of like you're suckling at the mother goddess, you know, and it's all good, and in that moment there's no evil and there's no badness, and you're just having this oneness with this, you know, omnipotent, you know, containing authority that you're merged with, or you identify the good with, and that there's a danger in that, because you're not looking at the, you know, the more realistic other, you know, the darker side of things, or the frustration aspect of it. But fantasy out of the lack, you know, like projections and fantasies they come out of when you're longing. So a transitional space opens up, and you get to sort of feel contained in that transitional space with the unavailability of the containing function.
Yeah.
I think I just have to add that what I was saying earlier about that mysticism and that states, those are actually okay, those are, for lack of a better word, those are actually higher states where you have to earn it. Because what I understand what you're saying, Sandy, and I mean to put it in another way, about those people that you see they get lost in the oneness and all. I mean, that is the reason why LSD trips are temporary. You see that people who use LSD, they can tell you all about that oneness and the realizations, but the important thing is, were they able to bucket anything down and integrate into their daily lives? And it's always a small percentage of the people who manage to do that, you see, no matter how many times they do LSD. But the mysticism thing that I was talking about, it is that, but it is, I guess, for a lot of people, it would be the kind of thing that towards the later part of the journey that you kind of earn. So it's in the zone of, I think that it's in the zone of that Jung quote. I might not be saying this totally correctly, but he said, I think this was kind of post Red Book or at the far end of the Red Book, where he said something like, beyond the meaninglessness and the meaningfulness, when you get beyond the chaos of that, then there is the supreme meaning. And it's the area of the supreme meaning that this mystical area that I'm talking about lies in. So it's a different domain, and I should have qualified that earlier on. But maybe Skip can tell me what that quote is, if he remembers.
I don't remember that specific one, but, obviously, in the sense that we have to grow above religion, okay? In other words, religion is all well and good, okay? And I've discussed this in detail in my talk called Finding the Living God, which I actually did in a sanctuary. But religion is a form of psychotherapy, right? And so if you get lost in the religion, then you can't come back. It's hard to get back to the real world. So, somebody that gets lost in a religion and says, well, only my kind of Christian is going to survive and everybody else is going to die during this corona pandemic. I've heard that a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, that they think this is the end times. And so therefore, only the people that go to my church are going to be saved. So I'm going to go to church no matter what they say about the coronavirus, because my church knows how to avoid it, and none of your other churches know how to avoid it. So, too bad, the devil take the hindmost. I'm going to go to my church. And, a couple of those pastors that said that, they're dead now. The coronavirus got them, right? And so I want to go back to this idea of the mirror and the holy, in the sense of the term namaste in Hinduism, where you hold your hands in a prayerful attitude and say namaste to another person. And that says, that which is holy in me sees the holy in you, basically, is what its meaning is. And we need to get to the point where that's the expectation globally, okay? That's our attitude toward one another. But I wanted to get back to a couple of things here in this section.
Skip, let me
go ahead.
add something
Jerome.
about what Nick.
Yeah,
Was it
please.
Nick? Is it Nicholas or Nick? Nick? Is it Nick?
Nique. Okay.
Okay.
And then
All right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, what he was saying was, I think it's probably a significant point that I saw was that when you do a drug of some sort or have a brief experience, and you can get blindsided by that, and that's really a disassociation and a disconnection. You're going too far on one side. And the idea of what he was just saying, the goal is to integrate
Yeah.
the two and not split. And
Right.
that's where people get trapped in what's called spiritual bypassing. They never come to terms with their ego and their shadow, and they never do that. And so then they get this big ego inflation. Or on the other hand, they can be drawn in and get a ego deflation.
Mhm.
So they're sucked into the pit, so to speak. So,
Right.
but I think it's just one of the important things, and until we can integrate that, that's your namaste. You know, honor you and honor you. Then you're at that flow point, and you can
Yep.
just come from that point. So,
Right. But I think that that's where the species needs to get. And this is what, this is why when Joss said the coronavirus is the love virus is so profound, because it's it's forcing us to recognize that this is the largest event that's happened to the human species ever, okay, in terms of happening to everybody at the same time. And we're all in the same leaky boat, and we need to recognize that. Um, and and so somehow we need to pull that together, and that involves all the religions who have turned away from one another, turning back toward one another, and understanding that all of them have done the same thing, basically. And the differences, the turning away from one another by splitting. I think Sandy's talking about splitting. Well, here's a great example. Martin Luther splits from the church, and then the side of the church that went with him just kept splitting, right? So that now there's more than 400 denominations of Protestants, and even the Catholic Church split. And my understanding is that there are five forms of Catholicism now. There's Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, whatever they are. And so those were the splits away, and saying, that's the bad breast over here, and here's the good breast, right? And
well, it's basically I'm right and you're wrong.
yeah, but
It goes
now
all through the whole stream.
yeah, but now we have to turn back and say, what's right about you, and is that also right about me? So that this is where the namaste comes in, that we take people as being more good than evil. I wanted to share this image of that Jacob Bohm did, because Jung thought this was profound, and I want to share it with you because he mentions it here in this section. So here's a mandala, but it's a split mandala, and the two sides are facing away from one another instead of toward one another. And he says the visionary genius of Jacob Bohm recognized the paradoxical nature of the God image, and thus contributed to the further development of the myth. The mandala symbol sketched by Bohm is a representation of the split God, for the inner circle is divided into two semicircles standing back to back. So it's an interesting idea, anyway.
And that kind of relates to what we were talking about, the shadow side of God. And one thing I forgot to mention about the Gnostics was that they created their higher power was the god of Raxus.
Yeah.
And if you're familiar with that, Hermann Hesse wrote in his book about Abraxas, and so he's one that's both sides. He's both sided. So he's kind of like that diagram there, and eventually you can merge the two.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just throw in my little 2 cents here.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to say this has been a really interesting conversation in this whole process. Sandy, you did a terrific job of bringing the psychoanalytical portion of, the primitive good breast, mother breast, and the biting is very graphic. Yes, I love it. And Jerome, about the blending in of the good and evil, the dualism, it has to go to, that blending and bringing it together. And Nick, for your insights into, well, actually it's pretty deep that I kind of, I got a little bit lost into it, but I kind of understood where you're coming from. But I think Jerome, you kind of like brought it in together. And then of course, Skip, you kind of like nailed it with Namaste, because Namaste is a higher level of understanding. What your wife would told me, and it sticks to me, that opposites, good and evil, are opposite sides of the same coin.
Yes.
So it's all God, right? If the coin is God, it's just the opposite sides of the same coin. And it's a matter of choice of what we want to experience, whether and I'm putting it together here, what Steve Holmes, Tim's brother, brought out during Easter Sunday about the 2 different gods. If we choose the God of love versus the God of punishment, the good or the bad God. And it all depends on perspective. So with that perspective, you have a point of view of what is, if you're in that level of duality of good and evil, and you'll really get really involved in it, depending if you choose the God of, say, punishment, the God of judgment, where if you choose the God of love, where there is no judgment, then you have a blend of good and evil. Now it's like, what are you talking about? It's hard to understand because it's a paradoxical level. It's a higher level of understanding, a different level, layer. It's almost going into like the 4th dimension, if I may, put that spin on. I remember a saying that stuck to me when I had this friend of mine who was so angry that she was upset. She was a doctor and she was upset about being cheated by this other doctor. And she said, oh, that doctor is so evil, so evil. And she was Christian and so forth. And anyway, I tried to calm her down, and I threw her a loop that it stopped her in a track. I said, I told her, Lenny, God said, love your enemy. And I obeyed him. So I loved myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of stopped her in its tracks, because when you think about it, enemy is also a judgment. And
Sure.
when you pinpoint a person who says, you're bad, you're my enemy, but then you look into yourself and you flip it around. Well, have you not cheated before in your lifetime, or betrayed someone in your lifetime, or hurt somebody in your lifetime? And then you had to forgive yourself and realize that you had to love yourself in order to forgive. So that's where, you know, it all boils down to that namaste. Can you see the good in and the sacredness in that person? Because that person is a reflection of you too. That's it.
Right. Right. That person is a reflection of you too. Right.
Great, great.
How,
Yeah, the only thought was that there is some hope in terms of what Nick was saying, is because we have all this knowledge now on the internet, we can pretty well decide which path we want to take, because we're aware of the consequences now.
yeah.
And we can decide which way do you want to go. And that to me, that's knowledge of that is
Right.
what we've got now. Whereas before we were just going by, you know, we're just kind of blindly in the dark.
People would come to you and say, hey, why don't you drop LSD? It's a good trip type thing, right? And that's all you'd hear. And you go pop, and away you go on a trip. But, you know, now we know what the consequences of that are, right?
Well, we do, but sometimes kids not,
well, kids don't
children,
have enough. I do want to thank Sandy for your breath of fresh air, Sandy, because normally we're in the old guys realm, right? Because Jung wasn't very interested in anybody under 35, basically, and so it's fairly rare for us to be talking about issues that begin at birth. But you're quite right that these issues are there right from the very beginning. And
yeah, I was going to add that you know, with the namaste, that you know, if another person is a reflection of yourself and they ought to be good enough, there does need to be the individual's experience of having internalized good enough caretaking.
yes.
So in order to have internalized that, you have had to have, you know, a long stretch of it, so that your internal objects, we call them internal objects,
Mm-hmm.
And you access those internal objects and then see them in others.
Right.
But the people that have been devoid of good enough internal and internalized good enough objects, relation is
so obvious. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't.
So I just, you know, I just would caution us to keep that in mind, because we can say people should or they ought to, and it would be a better consequence and things like that. I mean, it's all, you know, very magical to just hope that people would just catch on to the better interest of humanity and themselves. But there are people that lack that capacity. And the only thing they know is bad. They only internalize bad internal.
Right. Right.
And they will only bad. They will only project bad outward in the paranoid schizoid sort of state. And we're in a pickle in that regard.
Right. And Jung says here on page 335, ultimately we have to seek compensation and unity. Okay, we can't be split like that and live a successful life. And so I wanted to I guess we'll end with this. And so Nancy's got to get another crack at this, because I see that the next section is some of his commentary on the Christian message, and I'd love to have Nancy here for that.
Yeah,
also.
I would too. We did one paragraph again.
No, we did more than one paragraph, but I mean, I'm skipping ahead. I'm skipping the God image, because I've talked about the God image for the last 3 years on this channel. So it's really, not relevant except in the context of what I'm going to read now, but the question is, how do we find the solution, right? And so what I'm saying though is, after this, we'll stop, save the Christian message part for next week with Nancy, and we'll just keep at it until we've done it. But so the point here is that logic doesn't provide us with a solution to the opposites, really. And so he says, and I want to, while I'm reading this, I'm going to share an image from the Red Book because it's very apropos to this specific section. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to share. Let me unshare. What I want to share is over here. Okay, so you're seeing this image. This image is actually the adept or Jung or whoever floating over the city of Basel. And what's unique about this is that the city of Basel is in the mountains, but this is Basel with the seashore coming up against it, right? And so the adept is in a special place, and he's having this numinous experience of the God image above his head in his visioning. So then I'll read what he says here. If all goes well, the solution seemingly of its own accord appears out of nature. Then and then only is it convincing. It is felt as grace, since the solution proceeds out of the confrontation and clash of opposites. It is usually an unfathomable mixture of conscious and unconscious factors, and therefore a symbol, a coin split into two halves which fit together precisely. It represents the result of the joint labors of consciousness and the unconscious, and attains the likeness of the God image in the form of the mandala, which is probably the simplest model of a concept of wholeness, and one which spontaneously arises in the mind as a representation of the struggle and reconciliation of opposites. The clash, which is at first of a purely personal nature, is soon followed by the insight that the subjective conflict is only a single instance of the universal conflict of opposites. Our psyche is set up in accord with the structure of the universe, and what happens in the macrocosm likewise happens in the infinitesimal and most subjective reaches of the psyche. For that reason, the God image is always a projection of the inner experience of a powerful vis-a-vis. This is symbolized by objects from which the inner experience has taken its initial impulse, and which from then on preserve numinous significance, or else it is characterized by its numinosity and the overwhelming force of the numinosity. In this way, the imagination liberates itself from the concretism of the object and attempts to sketch the image of the invisible as something which stands behind the phenomenon. I am thinking here of the simplest basic form of the mandala, the circle, and the simplest mental division of the circle, the quadrant, or as the case may be, the cross. And so this symbol of the circle and the cross is addressing the opposites up and down, left and right, and all in one, and that is numinous. So the numinosity is represented by the red flames and the yellow flames, and it's just an incredible image that Dr. Jung painted to express what he was talking about. And I do notice on some denominations in Christianity that that symbol of the mandala with the cross, equal-sided, does appear in their, you know, I know of one in Pasadena that it's right up there on the steeple, that symbol. And so, you know, I think a lot of theologians know this at some level. I don't know how consciously they know it, actually. I'm actually doubtful. I mean, I think some theologians are just basically taught the catechism and said, this is what you say on this day, you know, this is what you say on Palm Sunday, and this is what you say on Easter, and they don't really know what's behind it at all, I suspect. I mean, that's a lot of people that hold themselves out to be theologians. That's what troubles me, actually, about the church as we experience it in the U.S. anyway. But that's just a personal predilection. Any comments on that?
I've come across a number of theologians that have ended up studying it so deeply they've become atheists.
Well, then they have to study it even more deeply, Sandy, because then they have to come back to the church. I mean, if you study it so deeply that you become an atheist, that means that you've moved from the third stage of consciousness to the fourth. And what they have to do is they have to reach the fifth stage of consciousness, which is to be a realized theologian who understands how the scriptures are actually true.
I wonder if that's what Nietzsche went through.
Yeah, probably, you know, to a certain degree. Although Nietzsche, I don't know. Have you ever really read Nietzsche?
Yes.
Beyond
Good and Evil.
Right.
Do you know that? Do you know why they said that? It said that Nietzsche failed his. Nietzsche, it has been seen that he went through a failed initiation. Do you know anything about that?
A what initiation?
A failed initiation.
A failed initiation. I mean, the context behind that is I just recently been reading Henry Corbin, which was someone that Jung associated with very closely, especially when it came to things to do with the imaginal world, which is very red book stuff. And in this book I was reading, it said that at a certain point, Nietzsche felt that he had penetrated into the nihilistic ground of being or something like that, and you know, made it that far. And in the view of Henry Corbin's imaginal world, which comes from Sufi mysticism, it was said that Nietzsche actually failed to see that was the darker side of the black pole, which is a certain stage of consciousness. So Nietzsche couldn't penetrate beyond that. He got caught up. I mean, I forget the exact thing, but he got caught up in the part about a personal God and how he didn't attain sufficient mystical poverty. That's what the book said. Yeah, I was just wondering.
I can see that. I mean, his attempt to have to, you know, write up the genealogy of morals just speaks to it.
Yeah,
right.
I'm a bit of an iconoclast about Nietzsche because I think a lot of his problems had to do with the fact that he had a mental breakdown from syphilis, and you know, that fact is swept under the rug a lot, but you know, he spent the last 10 years of his life in an asylum exactly because of that. And, you know, what Edinger said about Jung's perception of Nietzsche was that he was morbid, and morbid in the mental health sense. And, as I've never, well, I read Zarathustra, I guess, but I never really read Nietzsche in black and white. What I've done is I got several audiobooks of Nietzsche. And if you listen to a reading of Nietzsche, oh my God, it's like it goes up and down and up and down. And very soon you get seasick listening to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, it's like being out in the sea in a storm.
I recently had after my nephew got his injury, his birth injury, I was so depressed.
Mm-hmm.
Would cry every night worrying about him on the nights that I wasn't with him. And I was in such a weird, dark place that the only thing I wanted to listen to was Nietzsche. And so I put all of Nietzsche for 2 years on audiobook.
Oh.
I listened to it like through the night, through the day, over again. And I did definitely feel seasick, but it was just like the only thing at that time. I was like in my cave,
Well, it's in all of us, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
the point. Isn't that the point? And I agree with your point here on the chat that, psychoanalysis and analytical psychology are also a form of religion. Absolutely. But, I cover this in detail in my talk, Finding the Living God, but maybe for clarity here, I should go over the stages of consciousness, just so we have a baseline here. So stage 1 is participation mystique, participation mystique, where you're an infant and you do what mom does or what mom guides you to do, whatever, what have you. And, it doesn't get much beyond that. Then in stage 2, your parents become your gods. And I explicitly remember a time when I was 5 years old when I looked up at my mother as we were driving through Montana or the Badlands of South Dakota or something like that. We were driving across the country. And I was 5 years old, and I looked up at my mother, and I just realized she was a goddess. Okay, I had that numinous feeling, and I very clearly remember that moment. And so then stage 3 of consciousness is when you project your gods out according to your faith tradition. And so, you whatever that is, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or what have you, you project the gods onto this faith tradition as you're taught it. But then the next stage, the 4th stage, which is what we've been suffering with in the 20th century, since Nietzsche correctly said that God is dead, it becomes nihilism. Okay, and so as you correctly said, a pastor who studies it so hard ultimately becomes an atheist, and that becomes nihilistic. But the next stage, the stage that they have to get to, the stage that Jung observed and indicated that we have to get to this 5th stage at least, and he actually posited 7 stages. But in the 5th stage, you have to look back at the religions and understand what they are. And you become nihilistic when you realize that these stories aren't true in the physical world. Okay, and what Jung pointed out is that every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physical world. I mean, to the extent that the Bible is a historical document, then it's a history book. Okay, those things are true. But when, or true enough, okay, in the sense that there was a Peloponnesian War, and yes, there was a Troy, and yes, there was, there was probably a Helen of Troy. But is Ulysses actually, or the Odyssey actually, a blow account of those times? Well, probably not. I mean, maybe the history of the Peloponnesian Wars is, maybe Thucydides is, but still they have lessons that we learn from, and that's why we learn those myths. And so all the religions are trying to bring about the transformations that we have to go through in our lifetime in order to live our lives. And they do that in a very ritualized way that has worked over many years. The problem that we got to when Nietzsche said God is dead is that God, the way it had been taught for 1900 years, yes, that was dead, because people looked in a telescope and they said, there's no God up there. There's no devil down here. And they looked in the microscope and they said, there's nothing in here either. These are, just atoms and quarks and things. And so the rationalists use that as an excuse to throw religion away. But what they did was they threw the bathwater out with the baby, threw the baby and the bathwater out. And everybody needs to go back and look at all these religions and see what they were doing for us from a mental health point of view, because that was Jung's point, that every religion is a grand scheme of psychotherapy, as you correctly said, Sandy. And so we need to go back to them and try to internalize what they do for us, why it's important to have the cycle of ritual that is in the Christian church or what have you. All of every religion has its own series, but they all are trying to achieve the same thing. Anybody want to comment there before we wrap up?
Well, it's part of your cultural upbringing and background and our whole history. And, the religious groups, they perform a very valuable social function.
Absolutely.
Today, I mean, they're the most giving people, and I have no problem with that. What we're talking about is the experience, and the way I understand Nietzsche is that his bottom line is about power, and Jung's bottom line is about love. So the manifestation of the essence in Nietzsche was all about power, and Jung was all about love. And that's the difference.
Can I say one or two before you close?
Yeah, go ahead.
On that same line, Jerome, Thomas Campbell said, the problem...
Joseph Campbell said, the problem and the purpose of religion is to awaken the heart. So I just want to leave you with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
good.
so and that's what Jung's entire work was about. And, that's why Jordan Peterson, for example, completely missed the boat. Okay, because Jordan Peterson wants to save the logos, quote unquote, and he wants to save hierarchy and save civilization as we have known it type thing. That's what he projected his mission out at after 12 Rules of Life and all that. But that's a completely one-sided and very shallow perception. And so then, he said he bounced off Ion, the book Ion, which he thought was the scariest book he ever read or something to that effect. and he simply hasn't been able to make that leap, that you need to have this balance with love. Okay, you need both. We need logos, but we need love too. We need our lives. And
yeah, he never talks about the reconnection of what's been lost. He never gets to that point.
He never gets to that stage, and so he's sort of rambling around in the nihilism of the 20th century, and he wants to go back to that sort of structure and that hierarchical idea of what it's all about, and that's not what it's all about. It's about both. But
well, he does have one good point, is he's building a strong ego for people that do not have. Before you need to get a strong ego before you broach this point. So, I mean,
that's
I have no problem with what he's doing. So it's just,
well, that's right, and he's a father figure to many, and we have 50% of all young males. I mean, 88% of the internet is young males, and
and they were lost.
They're lost because half of them were never fathered. Okay, they lived in broken homes and they were raised by their mothers, and so Jordan Peterson has provided them with the sort of guidance that a father might offer. And that's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with that. And I often say that I agree with him 99.5% of the time. But, it's just this last bit where not only he, but also John Vervaeke and Anderson Todd haven't understood Jung at all. They're just out in space. And, Anderson Todd's the teacher of Jung at the University of Toronto, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And this is a point that Jung made about academics who get themselves all wrapped around a crank about some logical structure, and they, it's like the consultant who knows 150 ways to make love but doesn't know any girls. And something like that.
It's interesting that Thomas Arts, he was an academician in plasma physics, and he got disgusted with it, and he left academia because of that.
Mm-hmm.
The one, they get down one track and they just keep going, and they don't expand. So,
right. So my point is, we need the logos. We need, philosophers and all that philosophy. Okay, there's nothing wrong with learning those sets of rules and so on.
Yeah, I would prefer my airplane pilot not go off into outer space while he's flying the plane,
Yeah, and that's well and good, and but your airplane pilot flies the plane based on his experience, not based on a manual that he read, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and that's the point. And that's where the Eros is. The Eros is in the life. The manual is logos. Okay, you can learn everything you ever needed to know about flying a plane by reading a book. And you can even pretend you're flying a plane on a computer. Okay, I was doing that 25 years ago. I was flying a Cessna on a computer 25 years ago. But you know, you can't fly a computer until you've actually, or you can't fly a Cessna until you actually have done it. It's non-trivial what you have to go through to do it. We were watching this documentary about the man who jumped out of a balloon from 128,000 feet. His name was Felix Baumgarten, and the documentary talks about the fact that there was all this logos involved in it, but then there's lots of human factors there too. There's lots of Eros, where here he was a very, very capable base jumper who had jumped off of all kinds of rocks and buildings and so on. But when he got toward the big jump, there were some big obstacles that he had to overcome from a psychological point of view. And at one point he went away from the team for a whole year, and then came back. So have I lost you all? Are you there? Yes. Okay. I just wanted to see if somebody's moving in my video.
We were in a trance, Skip.
I know, but I mean, ultimately he did it, and it's a very moving documentary to watch that documentary, and to see, and he's the only one that's done it. And it's just beyond belief, actually, what he did. I mean, he went 834 miles an hour coming down.
We've been on almost 2.5 hours. Maybe we ought to call it.
Yeah, I think we should call it. So
Sandy, I love your digressions.
Pardon?
I do love your digressions.
Oh, thank you. I hope they're useful. When I finish these sessions, I never know what I've said. I have to go back at the video to remember what I've said.
In the flow, you're in the flow state. That's what.
Right. So, and that's what happens to me. It's always coming from the self. I'm not thinking about I'm not consciously logicking it out, what I'm saying or what I'm going to say. So, but anyway, thank you so much for being here and adding the youthful aspect of these psychologies that we usually don't get.
Yeah, thanks.
We need more of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jocelyn, Sandy.
Yeah, thanks, Joss.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Aloha, everybody.
Yeah. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you all again soon.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon. So Nick, you're on for a week from Saturday, huh?
So about 2 weeks time, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, for sure.
12 days from now. Okay. Peace.
Okay, well, got it. Peace.
Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
It'll be Sunday morning your time, 10 a.m. Sunday morning.
Got it.
Skip, just to remind you to click off of YouTube first before you click off.
How do I do that?
Go to more.
Uh-huh.
And then click off